Good evening. I'm Bob Kurth, and I came here tonight to share a story with you. This is one of many stories written by a gentleman by the name of Robert Service, who as a 19-year-old left his home in Scotland and traveled across the ocean to the Yukon Territory of Canada. Went to work for the Bank of Canada as a teller, and while he was working there, he talked to a lot of the men from the camp and the miners themselves, and heard many of the tales that described the true hardships of the Yukon during the gold rush in 1896. The story I'd like to share tonight is called The Ballad of Blasphemous Bill. And it's a story about true commitment. I took a contract to bury the body of Blasphemous Bill Mackay whenever, wherever, or whatsoever the manner of death he die. Whether he die by the light of day or under the peak-faced moon, in cabin or dance hall, camp or dive, in mucklucks or patent shoon, on velvet tundra or virgin peak, by glacier, drift or draw, in muskeg hollow or canyon gloom, by avalanche, fang or claw, by battle, murder, or sudden wealth, by pestilence, hooch, or lead. I swore on the book I would follow and look till I found my tombless dead. For Bill was a dainty kind of cuss, and his mind was mighty sot on a dinky patch with flowers and grass in a civilized boneyard lot. And where he died or how he died, it didn't matter a damn, just as long as he had a grave with frills and a tombstone epigram. So I promised him, and he paid the price in good Chachaco coin, which that same I blowed that very night down in the tenderloin. Then I painted a 3-foot slab of pine. Here lies poor Bill Mackay. And I hung it up on my cabin wall, and I waited for Bill to die. Years passed away, and at last one day came a squaw with a story strange about a long deserted line of traps way back to the Bighorn Range. But a little hut near the Great Divide, and a white man, stiff and still, lying there by his lonesome self. And I figured it must be Bill. And I thought of the contract I'd made with him, and I took down from the shelf the swell black box with the silver plate that he'd picked out for himself. And I loaded it up with grub and hooch, and I slung it on the sleigh. Then I harnessed up my team of dogs and was off at dawn of day. Do you know what it's like in the Yukon wild when it's 69 below and the ice worms wriggle their purple heads through the crust of the pale blue snow? When the pine trees crack like little guns in the silence of the woods, and the icicles hang down like tusks from under the parka's hood, when the smokestack smoke breaks sudden off, and the sky is weirdly lit, and the careless feel of a bit of steel burns like a red-hot spit, when the mercury is a frozen ball, and the frost fiend stalks to kill. It was just like that day that I set out to look for Bill. Oh, the awful hush that seemed to crush me down on every hand as I blundered blind with a trail to find. through that blank and bitter land, half dazed, half crazed by the Yukon wild and its grim, heartbreaking woes and the ruthless strife for a grip on life that only the sourdough knows. North by the compass, north I pressed, river and peak and plain, past like a dream I slept to lose, and I waked to dream again. North, river and plain and mighty peak, and who could stand unawed as their summits blazed? He could stand undazed at the foot of the throne of God. North I, north, through a land accursed, shunned by the scouring brutes, and all I heard was my own harsh words and the whine of the malamutes, till at last I came to a cabin squat, built in the side of a hill. I burst in the door, and there on the floor, frozen to death, lay Bill. Ice, white ice, like a winding sheet, sheathing each smoke-grimed wall. Ice on the stovepipe, ice on the bed, ice gleaming over all. Sparkling ice on the dead man's chest, glittering ice in his hair, ice in his fingers, ice in his heart, ice in his glassy stare. Hard as a log and trussed like a frog, with his arms and legs outspread, I gazed at the coffin I'd brought for him. Then I gazed at my gruesome dead. At last I spoke. Bill liked his joke, but still, gall darn his eyes, a man had ought to consider his mates in the way he goes and dies. Have you ever stood in an Arctic hut by the shadow of the pole with a little coffin 6x3 and a grief you can't control? Have you ever sat by a frozen corpse that looks at you with a grin that seems to say, you may try all day, but you'll never jam me in? Well, I'm not a man of the quitting kind, but I never felt so blue as I sat there gazing at that stiff and studying what I'd do. Then I rose and I kicked off the husky dogs that were nosing round about, and I lit a roaring fire in the stove, and I started to thaw Bill out. So I thawed and thawed for 13 days, but it didn't do no good. His arms and legs stuck out like pegs, as if they was made of wood. At last I said, it ain't no use. He's froze too hard to thaw. He's obstinate and he won't lie straight. So I guess I've got to saw. So I sawed off poor Bill's arms and legs, and I laid him snug and straight in the little coffin he'd brought himself with the dinky silver plate. And I came nigh near to shedding a tear as I nailed him safely down, and I stowed him away on my Yukon sleigh and headed back to town. I buried him as the contract called, in a narrow grave and deep, and there he's waiting the great cleanup when the judgment sluice heads sweep. I smoke my pipe and I meditate in the light of the midnight sun, and sometimes I wonder if they was the awful things I've done. And as I smoke and the parson talks, expounding on the law, I often think of poor old Bill and how hard he was to saw.